Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, and a warm welcome to the Prince Mahidol Award Conference webinar titled Health and Gender at the Intersection of Armed Conflict and the COVID-19 Pandemic. This webinar is organized by the Lancet Site Commission on Peaceful Societies through Health and Gender Equality in partnership with the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. My name is Joke Brandt. I'm the permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United Nations in New York, and I will try to be guiding you through our program today. Over the next 90 minutes, we will discuss the COVID-19 pandemic with a focus on its impact on health inequities and gender equality in the context of conflict-affected settings. We have speakers and panelists joining us from a variety of fields and expertise. Speakers will review the Lancet Sites Commission's research on the relationships among health equity, gender equality, and peaceful societies. Panelists will reflect on this research and share insight on how countries and the international community can best respond to the challenges of the pandemic and armed conflict, with a focus on health inequities and gender inequalities. Through discussion, we hope to identify suggestions for how interventions to promote gender equality and health equity can help to build back better from the pandemic and address the layered challenges of COVID-19 and armed conflict. We have structured the webinar in 3 sections. First, we will have an introduction to the Lancet Site Commission. Then we will have presentations from our speakers with brief reflections from the panelists. And after that, we will have a discussion through a Q&A session with the audience. But before we kick off, some housekeeping. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available online afterwards. We encourage the audience to place comments and questions in the Q&A function throughout the webinar. We will then get back to them in the discussion portion. Please, when asking your question, also indicate who the question is for. And should we not be able to get to all the questions, PMAC and the Lancet Site Commission Secretariat will follow up after the session. And finally, we have limited time and a full program. So I urge you all to stick to the agreed time limits so we can hear from everyone and have time for discussion. And I do apologize in advance if I do have to play the role of the annoying timekeeper. We are ready to go now, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hear from the speakers and the panelists. And I have the honor to introduce our first speaker, President Tarja Halonen. Tarja Halonen is the former and first female president of Finland and chair of the Lancet Site Commission. Bringing a wealth of expertise and experience from the international arena, Tarja Halonen serves on the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation, as an alternate co-chair of the High-Level Steering Group for Every Woman, Every Child, and in the WHO Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development. Welcome, President Halonen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. For me, Madam Ambassador, dear experts, dear friends. Also, thank you very much for this invitation to speak today. So I'm here in my capacity, as you mentioned, the chair of the Lancet Site Commission on Peaceful Societies through Health and Gender Equality, whereas, of course, I have some other connection points. So Lancet Site is an independent and international commission dedicated to identifying how health and gender equality can contribute to peace. The commission is hosted at SITE, which means the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformation, and is composed of a multidisciplinary group of researchers and practitioners with expertise in health, gender, and peace and conflict. So the Lancet Site Commission is examining first the relationship between key indicators of health, gender equality, conflict, and peace. Second, the impact of improved health and gender equality on peace. And then the third point, and how improved health and gender equality can contribute to more peaceful societies. As you will hear in this discussion, the Commission is putting forward a new framework and evidence by which to understand the intersections between the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, specifically SDG 3 on health, SDG 5 on gender equality, and SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. But as you all know, these are all 17 goals have a very strong interlinkages, so that we need to see them also as a whole picture. So dear friends, this year has shown us that the work of this Commission is actually groundbreaking, and it was before we had this COVID. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated in very concrete terms the importance of understanding security in more comprehensive way. Of course, we have tried to underline this fact earlier, but I think that even the slowest one have noticed it now during this year. The most pressing security challenges of today are manifold. Pandemics, climate change, extreme poverty and inequality, and countries cannot fight these threats with increased military spending, arms race, or turning inwards. And this is not underestimating about so-called old enemies. So climate change or pandemics do not respect state borders. In order to tackle these challenges, we need much wider collaboration and more diverse crises, also be more prepared and also a lot of capacities. For example, public health can also be a question of security. We have a better understand what constitutes a peaceful and stable society. And this is exactly what the Lancet Site Commission is doing, looking into the interlinkages of gender and health to peace. So the findings of this commission will help the international community to be better prepared for conflict prevention and to recognize its priorities in building and supporting sustainable peace in fragile settings and strengthening resilience everywhere. You all know that we used to say that there is no peace without sustainable development and no sustainable development without peace. Promoting and protecting human rights and strengthening education, healthcare, equality, and the space for the civil society can also contribute to a resilient society. I would say that it's very, very important for that. I continue to highlight the importance of sustainable development to peace and women's role in peace processes as a member of UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board of Mediation. So we have also underlined the importance of the women's role. So it's also true in this pandemic. Women have really been in front lines. A large majority of the health workers or other first responders, they are women. Women-led countries have done quite well in the fight against this pandemic. Women's knowledge, both as an individuals as well as on the governmental level, has been of great importance during this historical time. So gender equality is one of the most predictors of peace. Studies show that women's participation in peace processes results in more durable and stable peace. I don't say that it will make the peace process easier. Obviously, if you have the more participants, it can be more complicated, but the result is the importance. So excluding women from the political decision-making or from peace tables can cost money and it can cost lives. So in that way, what we are speaking, it's also for the whole society. With these very short words and thoughts, I want to wish you an interesting discussion today. And as I promised already before we started this program, so I will be your active listener, and I'm ready if I can also to respond if there is something what you would like to ask from me. Thank you very much and have a good discussion.
Thank you, President Halonen, for providing this perspective and for outlining the interlinkages between health, gender, and peace, SDG 3, 5, and 16, as you said, and also for highlighting the important role that women play. And I think your introductory words are a perfect segue to our next speaker, Valerie Percival. Valerie is Associate Professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And she is also a commissioner on the Lancet Site Commission, where she leads the Commission's Metrics Working Group. Valerie will discuss the landscape of health and gender inequalities and inequities in conflict-affected settings, how COVID-19 has impacted on that context, and preview the Lancet Sites Commission's conceptual framework. Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much, President Hallinan, for that excellent introduction. So as President Hallinan mentioned, the work at the Commission has gained even more urgency given the projected impact of COVID-19 on fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So we are arguing that it really is a critical moment for the global health community. It's a critical moment for us to find our voice and advocate for populations trapped in cycles of violence and fragility, to push political leaders to articulate a clear and unifying message, the protection of human dignity and the promotion of human potential, and to embrace and advocate for the power of health and gender equality interventions to contribute to more peaceful societies. We are currently in the process of preparing our draft report, so your feedback on these ideas will be particularly timely. Almost a quarter of the world's population lives in fragile context. This conflict and violence undermines the ability of men, women, boys, and girls to live in dignity and fulfill their potential. Current trends do not give grounds for optimism. The number of conflicts is increasing, driving civilian displacement to even higher levels. Moreover, the combination of climate change and the potential long-term economic and social impacts of COVID-19 risk exacerbating these drivers of conflict. Food insecurity is rising, affects millions. Extreme poverty is increasing for the first time in 22 years. This coincides with the decline in diplomacy and support for multilateral engagement in many of these settings and concerns about the future of development assistance. This figure from Uppsala University's conflict data program shows that the number of conflicts in Asia, represented in teal, and the Middle East in orange, continues at very high levels. But the number of conflicts in Africa, which is represented in yellow, is actually increasing. This violence has devastating impacts on health and well-being. While many civilians are killed in the fighting, the indirect effects of conflict are even more significant. This includes damage to health services and other public infrastructure, economic disruption, the interruption of schooling, the long-term consequences of sexual and gender-based violence, and the lingering effect of conflict on mental health. These indirect effects of conflict are gendered and cause elevated morbidity and mortality for years after the conflict ends. Oops. To explore these dynamics, the Commission has adopted a framework that employs the concept of vicious and virtuous cycles. Violence clearly puts societies into a vicious cycle where conflict leads to poor health and gender inequality, which in turn undermines social and economic well-being. This adds additional fuel to the factors that drive conflict. Yet research also tells us that gender equality and good health contributes to the conditions that we know foster and support peace. Gender equality and healthy populations support economic development, build social capital, help with social cohesion, contribute to strong institutions and good governance. Gender equality, good health, and peaceful societies therefore operate in virtuous cycles. The key question driving our Commission is, how can societies transition from vicious to virtuous cycles? And what is the role of health and gender equality in that process? The Commission is examining how interventions to promote health and gender equality can work as a lever to help nudge communities and societies on the pathway to the virtuous cycle. So the Commission acknowledges that improving health equity and gender equality are not the only factors that contribute to peace. Moreover, research shows that they're not necessarily the most important factors in ending violence. Diplomacy, mediation, and peacekeeping remain critical. Health and gender indicators are also slow-moving variables with improvements taking time, which means that their impact may only be felt over the long term. Yet the potential role of gender in health interventions as levers for change is insufficiently explored by researchers and policymakers. This may be a missed opportunity. The promotion of good health and gender equality are key areas of engagement for civil society, domestic governments, and international actors. The Commission's research suggests that interventions to support gender and health can nudge communities and societies to more virtuous cycles through three main pathways. Health pathways. These are well-designed health interventions that are accepted by the population, and these can help build trust. Moreover, the universal provision of these services can reduce inequities between groups and support social and economic development. The gender pathways include context-appropriate interventions that support gender equality, and these can boost social capital, enhance female labor force participation in economic development, support civil society advocacy, and enable women's involvement in governance. As President Hallinan said, there is a clear association between women's political participation and higher government capacity. The combined pathway is when interventions channeled through the health sector promote both gender equality and health equity. One important example is the provision of comprehensive reproductive health services, which facilitate women's reproductive control, reduce their dependency ratio, and enable participation within the labor market. Another example is the creation of more gender equitable health services, systems, and plans, enhancing women's roles within the health sector and promoting gender equality through the delivery of health services. The combined pathway also enables the health sector to provide leadership and advocacy for gender equality, social equity, and peace. As we were having our second commission meeting in London in early March, the COVID-19 pandemic was starting to roll across the world. So we're asking ourselves, what will COVID's impact be on fragile and conflict-affected states? Will it entrench these vicious cycles? Will it undermine these pathways to virtuous cycles? Or will it create an opportunity for a reset to build back better? The direct health impact of COVID-19 on fragile and conflict-affected settings does not seem to be as severe as early models predicted. So this is a graph showing in the purple line the confirmed cases of COVID-19 in fragile contexts. There does seem to be a geographic concentration with a higher burden in Asia and the Middle East and a lower burden in Africa. And while the data is poor, COVID-19 is also one health issue facing these settings among many. But the early predictions of health system and societal collapse were thankfully avoided. While the direct impact of COVID-19 on fragile and conflict-affected states may not be as severe as in higher income contexts, the indirect social and health consequences are significant. A multitude of health services has been impacted by COVID, from immunizations to measles and other infectious diseases, malaria prevention and treatment, as well as access to sexual and reproductive health services. Fragile countries will also undoubtedly feel the pinch of the global economic disruption. These are World Bank GDP projections for fragile states for 2020 that show dramatic economic downturns. So the future is highly uncertain. For our pathways, the pandemic presents a complex road ahead with challenges and opportunities. It's illuminated the importance of health services for social and economic activity, as well as the resilience and dedication of health workers. But it also has revealed the devastating impact of structural gender and social inequities, as Andrew will discuss, and how problematic social norms are replicated and reinforced in health systems and pandemic response plans. Moreover, the increased importance of health services have also increased their susceptibility to misinformation, as well as cyber attacks. And as Jason will illustrate, health services continue to be a target of attacks from armed actors in humanitarian contexts. So the impact of the pandemic on trust in health institutions remains to be seen. On a positive note, the pandemic has showcased the power of global scientific cooperation and leadership. This critical role of collaboration among networks of local and international health actors has been humbling. As well, it's shown the incredible advocacy of women's global knowledge and advocacy networks to bring attention to the gendered effects of the pandemic. This has been extraordinary and could provide us with an important opportunity for change. So this is indeed a critical moment, and the urgency of this moment is really not being met by political leaders. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, recently stated, quote, "The pandemic is a clear test of international cooperation, a test we've essentially failed," end quote. So through its research and its report, the Lancet Site Commission will argue that it is a critical moment for the global health community to step up, to call for this political leadership and advocate for populations trapped in cycles of violence and fragility, to push political leaders to articulate a clear and unifying message, the promotion of human dignity and the protection of human potential, and for the global health community to embrace the power of health and gender equality interventions to contribute to more peaceful societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Val, for so powerfully setting the scene and for pointing out that this is indeed a critical moment for the global health community. May I remind the audience to please put questions or comments you may have in the Q&A function. And I now have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Arjamal Maktimova, who will reflect on Valerie's presentation. Dr. Arjamal is head of office and the World Health Organization representative to the Syrian Arab Republic. Dr. Arjamal has dedicated the past 20 years of her career to international humanitarian aid and development. And prior to her assignment in Syria, Dr. Arjamal was WHO representative in Oman, deputy head and emergency coordinator of WHO's office in Yemen, and held several posts in WHO Southeast Asia region. Dr. Arjamal, it's great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you, Valerie, for the presentation. I'm really grateful for the organizers and the Lancet Site Commission in taking a step forward to study health for peace through the lens of gender equality. I moved to Syria in the midst of international travel restrictions in late April, eager to support, especially carrying the experience from Yemen and being part of the team which worked on Health for Peace initiative with the Sultanate of Oman, WHO Eastern Mediterranean region, and the government of Switzerland. Syria is my 10th duty station, and also this year, Syria is in its 10th year of conflict. In the international civil service over 22 years, I have never in my life I have seen the level of destruction which is in this country. The crisis destroys lives, systems and institutions that saves lives. We at WHO are assessing the level of destruction thanks to health resource availability mapping. The current data shows that only half of 113 hospitals in Syria, which were functional before the war, are currently fully functioning, and less than half of primary healthcare facilities are functioning. There are areas in Syria with fewer than 3 beds available per 10,000 population, which is 3 times less than in international standard. Economy, governance, actors create policies that are fundamental to equity. Conflict and its economy do not support equity, instead creating winners and losers, widening gaps. Conflict and actors create the economic policies that are not neutral, with distributional impact of those policies exacerbating inequalities. Among the biggest losers are ordinary Syrians in this case, caught by crisis. Over 90% of the population in Syria are under poverty line. 1/3 of the population are internally displaced across 3 control areas: government control, northwest Syria and northeast Syria. About 1.4 million people are living in the last resort settings, camp or camp-like settings. Majority of this population are being women and children. Furthermore, COVID widened international inequalities. For the fragile, disrupted health systems, it's much harder to cope with this outbreak response and its economic impact. We have witnessed needs across the country have worsened. Food security is increasing. For Syrian people, 2020 brought even deeper devastation, economy driven further down, devaluation of Syrian pound, regional economic crisis, sanctions, recent wildfires, ruining agricultural lands, all putting livelihoods at stake. As a practitioner, I'm hoping to discuss later on with you and share some practical examples of work on the ground we do based on multilateralism, which is important as ever. UN and its principles, because UN is actor in this conflict economy, and to discuss its principles in conflict and crisis context. And I would be happy to discuss also ceasefire, sanctions, and attacks on healthcare. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arjamal, and really looking forward to coming back to hear more from a practitioner when we have the discussion segment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the next two presentations and reflections will provide us with an opportunity for a deep dive into the subject matter. And our first speaker for this is Jason Phillips. And Jason is an adjunct research professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. He formerly served as International Rescue Committee's Vice President of International Strategy and Partnership. And Jason will share findings on COVID-19's impact on attacks on humanitarian aid in conflict-affected settings. Welcome, Jason, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brandt, and thank you very much, President Hallinan, for your introductory remarks. I did want to take just a very few moments to briefly share research that we've undertaken for the Lancet Site Commission Metrics Working Group, looking at violence against humanitarian aid in the age of COVID. So we know before COVID even began that humanitarian assistance and the provision of healthcare in conflict settings was a very dangerous endeavor. And our questions that we were asking a few months ago were how the COVID pandemic has affected this violence against humanitarian aid, and how does this violence support, challenge, or supplement existing research on aid worker insecurity. Very quickly, just to clarify the subject matter of our study, we were looking at violence against humanitarian aid workers, not necessarily or specifically the broader universe of health workers, nor specifically only those humanitarian aid workers in the health sector. We were looking at the left quadrant, which is humanitarian aid workers overall. We compiled a data set of incidents of violence perpetrated against workers, facilities, and supplies embedded in a humanitarian aid response during the COVID pandemic from January 1st until August 12th, 2020, which created a data set of 236 separate incidents from around the world. This was drawn from open source data, primarily the Aid Worker Security Database, supplemented with other search criteria from other open source databases and Google searches. We identified three variables in particular to try to help us, in addition to what is normally captured in this information. A target variable to try to differentiate between humanitarian health and non-health or undetermined targets of attacks. A gender dimension to try to identify incidents that explicitly reference violence against women or violence against other identities along gender lines, and a COVID dimension to attempt to identify incidents in which the COVID pandemic or response to it was explicitly referenced as a motivation, aggravator, or otherwise contributor to the incident, or where violence was directed against an individual, place, or assets explicitly embedded in a COVID response. So again, just very quickly, what did violence during the pandemic, during this period, look like against humanitarian aid? First and foremost, we can say that it played a relatively circumscribed role in the wider violence that we see. 18% of the incidents in our database had a COVID dimension. This roughly validates and extends some other recent research on aid worker violence, which claims that the number of major attacks against humanitarian workers related to COVID remained low. There was an initial fear at the outset of the pandemic that there would be an explosion of violence against aid directly attributable to COVID, which does not seem to have, at least as of yet, materialized. Secondly, we can say that most of the violence we see is not what might be considered severe. While 24% of the incidents overall involved a fatality, only 2 incidents out of the 236 that had a COVID dimension also involved a death. Most incidents, including those linked to the pandemic, are forms of lesser violence short of mortality, which warrant more study in our consideration in aid worker insecurity. Third, we do not see a clear relationship between the pandemic severity in a particular location and violence against humanitarian health aid. Here, it should be noted, we used the COVID case fatality ratio in the country where the incident occurred as a proxy, but we recognize that this is a potentially problematic proxy indicator and that we did not complete quantitative analysis. So this relationship should be taken with a grain of salt, but at first blush, it requires more investigation to determine, but does not seem to be the case. Fourth, we can say, and this follows historical data around aid worker violence, that the violence during the COVID pandemic has been concentrated in a relatively small number of countries, South Sudan, DRC, and Syria. It's important to investigate the historical and political context within each of those to understand violence truly in those settings. Fifth, violence has been perpetrated during the pandemic largely by civilian groups, such as the general public or aid recipients themselves, or by state security forces, such as law and order actors or police, rather than conflict belligerents. 75% of the incidents that had a COVID dimension, the perpetrator was also not an armed non-state actor, which has typically been a large focus of study in the research on aid worker insecurity. And finally, we would say that so far we do not see a strong correlation between gender and violence during the pandemic. However, we can't necessarily trust this data. We know very, very little about the individual incidents beyond the biological sex of the victims, and that may actually offer very little to no explanatory value and lead to a great deal of misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the role that gender plays in aid worker violence. So what do we know? Again, quickly in conclusion, we know that aid is dangerous and continues to be so during the COVID pandemic. We know that the pandemic itself has served as a precipitate to acts of harm against aid workers during this period, including against humanitarian health workers. But even though it appears that the pandemic has increased the risk of violence against healthcare across the globe, it does not yet seem to have materially transformed the security risk environment for humanitarian aid specifically. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions and the comments from the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jason. We do hope indeed for questions from the audience. I can't see any come into the in the Q&A function yet, so I do encourage you to put any questions or comments there. So for a reflection on Jason's presentation, I would like to turn straight away to El-Haj Assi, who is a humanitarian aid expert and currently serves as co-chair of the joint World Bank WHO Global Preparedness Monitoring Board and as the chair of the Kofi Annan Foundation Board. He's also the former Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, where he served from 2014 until 2019. As has also held leadership positions with UNICEF, the United Nations Development Programme, UNAIDS, and the Global Fund to Find AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. As it's great to see you, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Great to see you too, Yoka, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Jason, for this presentation as well. Well, I cannot help but to be a little bit more emotional when you started your presentation by quoting the numbers of people, mainly humanitarian aid workers, killed while trying to save lives. These numbers and figures will never be able to really transmit the reality of the situation until you are intimately confronted with it. And I was one of those who had to sign these hundreds of letters of condolences, to the parents of friends and colleagues in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in northern Nigeria, in South Sudan, and in many other parts of the world, who lost their lives in the line of duty. These conflicts, they start, or we hardly remember when they start, and we don't know when they end. And we have now brutal, violent, armed conflict, and we nicely call them protracted crises. They are more than that. And those core settings, are not normal settings. Maybe I'm stating here the obvious, but let me just remind ourselves, that waking up in such a setting is not normal. Where you see proud women and men who overnight lost everything, including their own identity. No longer Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, but the victim, the refugee, the displaced, the beneficiary of humanitarian assistance. All appellations that are not identities, of anybody, except they are just situations, that one can find herself or himself in because of conditions and situations that one has absolutely no control over. And as I said, it starts and it doesn't seem to end. We hardly remember, we talk about Syria. Some of our younger colleagues may not even remember when it started. We're still there. When did we start in Afghanistan? When did we start in South Sudan? And then the list, goes on. In those situations, people are facing multiple deprivations. Of course, when we think about intervening there, we provide food, we provide water, sanitation, hygiene, things that people need, of course. But in those situations, people are crying for normalcy. They're crying for peace. They're crying for stability. They're crying for a situation that they call back, to what they are and trying to regain and preserve what is most important, for them, and it is most important for us, which is our human dignity. That permanent strive for human dignity itself is a journey that is paved, by so many challenges and vulnerabilities and risks that will exacerbate the dysfunctionalities and then deepen the invisible wounds, that people are confronted with. Waking up in this setting is risky. Fetching water is risky. Fetching wood to prepare food is risky. Caring for your loved ones, is risky. You can imagine who are behind those activities. Mostly women, mostly girls. So while we face multiple deprivation, we are not all equal in facing those deprivations. Some of us are much more vulnerable. Some of us are more often facing those risks, but unfortunately, they're often unnoticed, unseen, and not considered when we design and implement, in those programs, implement these programs. Living in times of COVID is not normal either. This pandemic reveals and exacerbates, those dysfunctionalities as we are seeing. As we can see, there may not be any direct, link, between COVID and those particular settings that we're talking about. But there's surely a link between COVID and, those invisible wounds, that people are living with. Well, let's not repeat the same mistake, namely that when we consider responding to the needs, of people, or even simply considering them and noticing them, we design what we call our life-saving interventions: food, water, sanitation, hygiene. And then we start to protect them. And then we're looking at also the other issue they face. You know, when we consider it that way, it will then be too late for too many, because during that time, many will be confronted with violence. Many girls will be trafficked, abused, many women will be killed. And again, it's not in silence. And it doesn't matter really where it is coming from. So we're saying that, you know, these perpetrators are not non-armed groups. But who are the non-armed groups? They may be during the day civilians, they may be in the afternoon part of the government, and they may be in the night a non-armed group. This is a totally messy situation, a situation of violence, you know, that we should not consider, you know, to be a normal situation, and if we should even stop, you know, calling it the protracted crisis, you know, so nicely. So gender equality, protection of women and girls are as life-saving as any other interventions. And if we include them right from the start in the life-saving package, and that is then the way we have to address the real situations of real people in situations that are not normal, and at times of COVID that is not normal. But we cannot help that if we hold these kind of meetings and these discussions, that while we appreciate everything we do, maybe the best way, and the best way really, you know, to put an end to all of that is to get back to peace and to stop violence. Thanks, Yoka, and I'll go back to you.
Well, thank you very much, As. And again, we hope to hear more from you later when we have our discussion segment. And first now for part two of our deep dive, I am pleased to welcome Anju Malhotra, is a Principal Visiting Fellow at the United Nations University International Institute of Global Health, where she's working on establishing a gender and health policy hub. She is the former Principal Advisor on Gender and Development at UNICEF, where she led 2 rounds of UNICEF's Gender Action Plan to advance the rights of women and girls in development and humanitarian settings. And Anju will present findings on the COVID-19 impact and risks for women and girls in conflict-affected settings. Anju, it's so great that you are here, and we're all looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Yoka. Thank you very much. And it's an honor to follow As, who was one of the champions of the Gender Action Plan that I developed at UNICEF, and his recognition of the very important role that gender inequality plays in conflict situations is visionary in many ways, and we wish more leaders in that system would recognize it. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing as part of the Lancet Site Commission on exactly what's happening on the ground and what data we have to see how women and girls are being affected by the addition of this challenge of COVID on top of all the other crises that they are facing in these situations. So the focus of our review was we tried to focus on specific countries within 4 regions, Middle East, Asia, East Africa, and West Africa, that we thought would provide us the most information on how COVID might be affecting gender issues. And they include some of the countries that the speakers previously have mentioned. And we tried to focus on 3 gender health related outcomes: gender-based violence, access to and delivery of sexual and reproductive health, and impact on female health workers. Clearly, there are many gender health related outcomes that could be related to COVID, but we thought we would get the most information on these. And there also what we actually found was that not only was the information differential by regions, some regions, for example, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, we could get more information. We could get less for West Africa, less for some of the parts of Asia, but also the most prominent information in the databases and in the different published or unpublished literature was on gender-based violence. Sexual and reproductive health delivery and access was less covered in the evidence review that we did, and female health worker impact was the least well covered. We can conclude, at least tentatively from the data that we have reviewed, that COVID-19 has reinforced drivers of negative impact because of the failure, precisely as As has mentioned, to enter gender into lockdowns and health response on COVID. And this has worked through three mechanisms. One is the biological and the physiological mechanism, where there are biological differences between men and women in their immune response on the comorbidities to COVID, but also the biological role that women have in reproductive matters. Women are still delivering babies, women are still getting pregnant, women still have to menstruate. Then there's a very large body of literature that is documenting the social norms related impact, which first and foremost, as As has already mentioned, is on women's care burden. And I'll talk a little bit about both paid and unpaid care burden. The acceptance of gender violence and the immunity with which it progresses, both in the home and in public spaces. And then the increased loss of women's mobility and their increased lack of access to technology, which becomes very critical in such a situation. And this was especially prominent in some of the Middle Eastern settings and in the Asian setting that we were looking at. And then there are sort of underlying structural systemic reasons for this enhanced effect on women and girls. One is that the health system has a lot of weakness in it on gender and is very gender biased to begin with. Then the male dominance in decision-making bodies in jobs and economic roles, the control of resources and information and technology, which is also very male biased, and then the lack of legal and customary rights for women. So some of the examples that we have documented in the trends is first and foremost the reduction in services on gender-based violence, which are not considered necessarily essential, and on reproductive health because resources and attention is being diverted to COVID. And those services become more difficult to deliver with lockdowns. The fact that women and girls particularly lack phones and internet access when so much now needs to be delivered through these virtual mechanisms is making it very difficult. And many of these women and girls don't have any privacy when they are being physically abused or have experienced sexual violence, on how to go about it without sometimes a perpetrator knowing about it. And this, of course, comes with women being locked into homes with their abusers and not having access to their networks, to their support mechanisms, and being able to travel outside for getting relief services. Then schools closing, of course, not only increases women's care burden, as we have noted elsewhere in the world as well, but also limits the future of girls who are not only now taking on more care burden, but there's increased child marriage. Women and girls have fewer access to economic resources. And in the conflict affected situations, the few channels that they had for independence are starting to get shut down. And then female health workers, especially, we're noticing, as elsewhere in the world, are being asked to take pay cuts, are working in the most unsafe working conditions with the least protective gear, and having to manage a higher burden of care. But we also saw some signals of turning this challenge that is exacerbating existing inequalities into potentially opportunities so that we can build back better for a virtuous cycle. It is bringing global attention to the fact of how distorted the system is on gender issues. And first and foremost, one of the interesting things we noticed in a recent study, for example, of 115 countries, where 87% of the leadership of task forces created for COVID and health in countries were led by men. And in the countries that we have examined, in the 12 that we were looking at, none of the task forces were led by women, not a single one. And none of the task forces had more than 20% female in them. Some of them had 0% females in them. So leadership bias is certainly one of the things that we have to fix, because that has come up front and centered. Women have to be part of these decision-making bodies. There's the issue bias. Certainly gender-based violence in conflict is a very prominent and very obvious issue to address, but there are other gender-related issues, such as women's work and what their care burden, that need to be addressed as well. Data is really bad, as Jason has also highlighted, and Valerie. And in this case, the surveillance data with gender focus was severely lacking, as was data on what's happening with men on their health burden and occupational vulnerabilities. The service bias is extreme. We don't tend to essentialize the services that women might need. And right now, as we are looking at new solutions by incorporating technology and information, this is a good time for us to really have women in a leadership role in that, and in devising those solutions and not just using them. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Anju. And I can now see questions coming into the Q&A function. We first, however, move to Shuvai Usman-Yoni for her reflections on Anju's presentation. Shuvai is a gender, peace, and security expert who is the executive director of the African Leadership Center, a research and training institution that focuses on raising the next generation African leaders, thinkers, and practitioners within the peace, security, and development sector. Shuvai previously worked for the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in South Africa, and her work includes documenting sexual violence in conflict settings. Please, Shuvai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yoka, and thank you for this opportunity. I want to just make 3 very quick points as reflection, both to to Anju's presentation, but also to some of the previous speakers. The first, and I'm relating it, of course, to my own areas of work and some of my own experiences. And the first is, and I think this is the really important aspect when you think about the health and gender equality at the intersection of armed conflict, is the centrality of the human being. And by human being here, I'm referring to the physical, the psychological, or the psyche, and the spiritual, and how armed conflict, is perpetrated against, all 3 of these aspects of the human being. So whether it's a female body or a female being, a male being, a girl being, or a boy being. And I think earlier there was a reference to violence, and I think in the question and answers we've already begun to see people asking about what we mean by violence and our understandings of violence, the absence of it, the presence of it, or the continuum along which violence happens. And I think as we look at and interrogate the intersections of health, gender equality, and armed conflict, it's essential to put this human being against whom violence is often perpetrated, or against whom conflict is perpetrated or plays out, in the context of conflict. So the human being as a site of conflict or a site of violence in armed conflict. And here again, just to make quick reference to COVID-19, in the context that I'm most familiar with or have been working most in recently, which is South Sudan, we have seen that along this continuum of violence, COVID-19 has intensified existing inequalities. And I think it's really important to just bear that in mind, I think, as Al-Haj Assay mentioned. The second area that I thought is important or interesting to think about is, and again, I think this has already been alluded to, but is a critical gap between these three pillars we are thinking about, which is health, gender equality, peace, and justice. And I think we often, and so I really like Professor Valerie's presentation when she was talking about pathways to virtuous cycles. And I think what is interesting is that we are coming from a place where we operate with these three pillars separately, whether it's from policy development, implementation, or even the way governance around these issues happen. But yet at the very basic level, in the way people's lives are lived, especially in conflict settings, these things are intersecting all the time. And so while yes, we need to think about pathways to virtuous cycles, I'm wondering whether we also need to introduce ideas of complex networks. And especially when you take settings like South Sudan, where there was not much of a health system or a health sector to be destroyed to begin with. It's just at the beginnings, it's just being set up. So where you're almost setting up these systems while you're simultaneously addressing some of these other issues. The third and last area is around knowledge production and research. And in order to answer many of the questions that have been put on the table and many of the conundrums that have been presented, how we leverage existing experiential knowledge in order to help us respond to some of these issues. And here I think there are three areas that we need to think about, or we may consider as we think about knowledge production and research. The first is, and I think Dr. Akjamal talked at length about some of these groups, is those in health service delivery, especially in emergency and conflict settings, so some of the humanitarians. How do we leverage on the experiential knowledge that these groups have? Because they are the ones who are living in this complex network. They're navigating these complex networks where these supposedly distinct pillars are intersecting and interacting at the same time. The second is local actors who are responding and they're doing the response work, the prevention work, the protection work. And this largely includes civil society, but it also includes local health workers. So your midwives, the people within the community who respond where there are health needs and health crises, especially as they happen in the midst of conflict. The final area is around the ordinary citizens who are the targets of the violence. And I think, again, Al-Haj referred to some of these groups. We often refer to them as perpetrators, but I think the interesting thing about engaging with some of these groups from a knowledge production and research perspective is about how it challenges our assumptions about what is the norm. So how some of these interactions could surface the non-visible views, but these non-visible views that form part of the normative frame of the societies that we are thinking about and working with. So I just wanted to make those three brief reflections, and we'll interact as the conversation progresses. Thank you very much, Yoka.
No, thanks, Shuvai, and a big thank you to all our speakers and panelists for their contributions and insights. It's really a perfect platform for our discussion, and I've already seen a discussion developing in the Q&A function. So let's just quickly move on. Let me ask our speakers and panelists to keep their responses brief and to the point, so that we can go through as many questions as possible. Our first question is for our panelists, Akjamal, As, and Shuvai, and it is, how have you seen countries in the international community responding to the layered challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, gender inequalities, health inequities, and armed conflict? And Akjamal, I'd like to turn to you first.
Thank you so much. WHO role in addressing COVID has been most prominent in coordination of the response of COVID with other agencies, partners, but at the same time, mostly, almost single-handedly, working on technical pillars like surveillance, epidemiological update, laboratory, communicating, adapting, and training on technical guidelines. We did face and do face challenges in terms of COVID response, which, for example, in Syrian context is expanding public health measures and achieving behavior change, because the desired behaviors we expected as a result of our risk communication community engagement efforts together with our partners in UNICEF, it has been very resistant to materialize in the context of Syria, where especially for those millions of Syrians who survive on daily wages, because they have to go, they have to bring food and put it at a table at the end of the day to their families. Protecting health workers has been also one of our challenges, because although it is not unusual to have more health workers, more and more health workers reported as COVID positive, we might not be doing well enough. Ensuring continuity of essential health services has been also our one of important aspects, and establishing reliable supply chain in the context when we have global market deficits, and Syria as a context also suffering from sanctions was not most helpful or conducive supporting factor in bringing those supplies quickly and timely. Obviously, COVID has been, our response to COVID has been in the backdrop of humanitarian emergency, exacerbated humanitarian emergency. That's why it was very important for us also to maintain basic health services. So we have been really firefighting in Syria. And I must say, while of course mental health has been also important, we have placed most important aspects on retaining vertical services, for example, polio and immunization services, which are going to be in a way wheels for us also to utilize next year our COVAX vaccine roll out. Because of exacerbated situation in economy, Syria is known as an exporter of locally produced pharmaceuticals. Currently, before the war, it was exporting to approximately 50 plus countries, and currently approximately to 10 countries. Medicines for especially non-communicable diseases, also to respond to COVID, has been halted for approximately 20%. So WHO had to shoulder also bringing NCT medicines. Trauma remains, but also nutrition, tuberculosis, and other health services have been important in addition to mental health, which has been really also having huge impact because of COVID impact on economy and losses being made to COVID, due to COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Agjemal. And as you already spoke a little bit about that during your in your reflection, would you like to add anything to that?
Maybe I could add only that I recognize that while in terms of COVID data in Syria, there is segregation by sex, and also there is a segregation among certain target high risk groups, for example, health workers. 56% of cases are among men, but I believe that we haven't done much on gender and also adding gender and COVID. While we are trying to look into also using WHO tools in bringing and understanding, trying to make research on gender and health. This is yet to be seen. It is not yet seen as a priority. Obviously, as I said, we have been doing really firefighting, and hopefully with the rollout of information, we will be able to look deeper in that aspect.
Okay, thank you very much, Akjamal. And I'd like to see if As or Shuvai, do you have anything to add to this from your experience? As maybe first, yeah.
Yeah, yes, please. And I appreciate everything that has been said, and of course, we need to appreciate all the efforts that have been made so far in recognizing, for example, the importance of gender-based violence in armed conflict, like Gita has put in her question, another champion, and also her very pertinent question about the other aspect, the socio-economic dimension of support and empowerment, of women, and the fact that the humanitarian community is not doing enough for that. I think we have all to plead guilty here, frankly. So while we appreciate the steps that we've taken, none of us, absolutely none of us, is doing enough. There is much more to be done, and the responses that we've been developing are not at the scale and the magnitude of the challenges that we are facing. So, and that's why Gita's question is so pertinent. Well, Gita, if we leave this in the hands of the humanitarian community alone, so we will fail again. The humanitarian community should do more, but everybody else should be also joining. So those days, when we had short humanitarian settings, where humanitarian actors, go in, trying to do something, and then we move quickly to the phase of recovery. And then from recovery, we move quickly to the development phase. Well, those days are gone because of the protracted nature of the crisis that we are seeing. So if you're doing humanitarian work for 20 years in a place, like Afghanistan, it is still humanitarian. How many years, are we working, Shuvai can tell us, in South Sudan? So 7th year, 8th year in Syria, and then the list, goes on. And now what we need is a continuum of partnership and a continuum of effort of all the way, from development, early alert, early warning, humanitarian response, and resilience building, and then back to development. And I think we have to embrace a kind of a long-term response that will be in partnership alongside of a continuum, because the lines between humanitarian development are getting blurrier and blurrier because of the very nature of the issues. But I think all of that forces humility, that we need to recognize maybe the achievements that we make, but just use it as a baseline and do much better and do more.
Okay, thanks, thanks, As, and also for responding to some of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A. And indeed, we're trying to sort of combine some of them. But first, Shuvai, would you like to add anything on this particular question?
Yes, please, Yoka. And just in addition to what has already been said, I think to be frank, especially in many of the conflict settings on the African continent, COVID-19 exposed, the non-preparedness, especially in conflict settings. And I think the responses, as we've already heard, have been insufficient in situations where resources are already a serious constraint. These have been diverted to urgent and important matters. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But I think for me, what has been most interesting is that firstly, again, we see that gender equality is relegated to an add-on or let's mainstream gender. Let us, deal with it later once we've dealt with the most important things, which are the silencing of the guns. But I think what has been interesting is to see the responses of civil society, and especially in the intersection of gender equality and the health needs around COVID-19, even some of the social needs. And I think there's a lot there to be learned and observed from how local organizing, mobilizing has happened in these contexts. Thanks, Yoka.
No, thank you very much for these additions. And as I said, thanks for the great discussion going on in the Q&A function. We're also trying to combine a couple of the questions, because there's a couple of questions to clarify what is meant by gender not being correlated with violence during the pandemic. And Jason has already explained this a bit in the Q&A, but these questions also relate to the lack of available evidence on gender as a factor. So Jason, can you explain a little bit more, and perhaps also the broader question about what the biggest gaps are you're seeing in evidence to understand how gender is correlated with violence in conflict settings? Jason, if you would.
Hi there, thank you. Yeah, I think these are outstanding questions, and unfortunately, in only 5 minutes, there isn't enough time to do justice to what we were trying to examine in the broader research. To clarify, right, that the focus of study here that we're looking at is violence perpetrated against humanitarian aid workers specifically. So, even in the paper that we write, and in echoing exactly what other observers have said here, the well-known disproportionate burdens, including the increase in domestic violence and other forms of violence that exist against women and that have been exacerbated or further exposed during the COVID pandemic, are the backdrop to this very specific and narrow study on the types of violence that are being perpetrated against humanitarian aid workers and humanitarian aid operations specifically. So pretty much every study of aid worker insecurity, most studies of violence against healthcare themselves acknowledge forthrightly that there is a huge gap in our knowledge about the gender dimension of violence against both aid workers and more broadly against healthcare workers in conflict settings. And there are any number of reasons which I think can account for that, including just blindness in the way that Anju talked about broader studies. That there's a lack of attention to the gender dimensions. There's a lack of information available, and when a lot of the searching that we do to construct these databases is based on media reports, which may not offer much in the way of an understanding about why a particular attack occurred. We might not have any information above and beyond, as I indicated, the sex of the victim, which may or may not really have anything to do with a gendered understanding of that violence. We do know that it is a factor. For example, one of the most horrific attacks, and to echo Asi's comments at the beginning about the incredible horrors that exist in each one of these data points. There was an attack in Afghanistan in I believe it was May of this year against a maternity ward in Kabul. Yeah. And one of the most horrific attacks you could imagine. And while there were, as we say, victims that went beyond women and children and infants, we know, for example, when we analyze that incident, that gender was a component of the motivation of the attack, right? The horror that would be caused by attacking a maternity ward was certainly part of the calculus that was used. But above and beyond that, it can just be extremely difficult to understand that. And it calls for, I call very clearly in the paper, as do most studies of violence against aid and violence against healthcare, call for much greater attention to and research specifically on the gendered nature of that violence and understanding what those specific risks are.
Thanks, Jason. We also have a couple of questions on power asymmetries, global leadership, and multilateralism. The asymmetry in power matters at global, national, and local governance and local level. And the question basically is about global governance related to peace and health that has not been reformed since the Second World War, and basically what is needed for a new inclusive multi-stakeholder mechanism. I saw that Val and Akshamal had already responded in the box, but maybe us and Shuvai might have further thoughts on this. So what is needed for a new multi-stakeholder mechanism? Maybe I could start with Shuvai, because you already started talking about the importance of also involving local leadership?
Thanks, Yoka. And yes, that is a really interesting question. I think, and I would like to tie it. There was another comment from one of the attendees on youth and youth agency.
Yeah.
And I think there is just such a great deal of knowledge that resides in the context where many of these things are happening. But I think the way in which we approach that knowledge perhaps is what needs to shift and change as one of the ways of changing the power asymmetries. And often I think when we talk about shifting power asymmetries, there's a lot of fear and reluctance, because it suggests revolution, right? So, and because any kind of shifting of power is revolutionary and it does disadvantage the power holder. But I think we could accommodate more less frightening ways of engaging with that rebalancing or reshaping power and how it's held. When we think about how the knowledge that resides in within a context, within local actors, within the citizens of a place, those most affected, is necessary and helpful in actually shifting and changing and transforming situations. I think that, as I was alluding to a little bit earlier on, in COVID-19 in South Sudan, for instance, we've seen women's rights activists, women's rights organizations, human rights defenders really stepping in to take charge at a civic level of information sharing, of reporting, of public education around not only gender-based violence, but many other things, including COVID-19. And it's really opened up it really has opened up the space in really interesting ways for them to not only do advocacy and engage with government or with the communities, but to document and to surface the kinds of knowledge that they are, the learnings and the tactics, the strategies that are being developed in this time. And I think it's really interesting work that needs more investment in order for us to begin to shift and shape some of these power asymmetries, because I think the reason that we are still using the same system since World War II is because we have not brought to bear the knowledge that exists, I think, in sufficient ways. So I think there's so much more that can be done. And I think that the knowledge community, the academic community really has to play a role in this. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And maybe, As, is there anything you would like to add to what Shuva just contributed?
Yeah, excellent points made by Shuva. But very briefly, breakdown in accountability, breakdown in leadership at local level and at the global level. But we are seeing now that leaders at the local level simply not caring about their citizens. And they should be held to account and then bear the responsibility of the situations that citizens find themselves in, be it in terms of conflict, be it also the lack of response and adequate response to COVID-19. At a global level, the breakdown in leadership has led to a lack of solidarity that has weakened the multilateral system. Now, we are hearing more and more about populism, we are hearing more and more about nationalism, which is quite a nice word, in the context, of COVID, but it is, plainly put, a level of egoism that is really very rare not to be seen at a time when we are facing a global threat where nobody is safe until we all are. These are all, I think, revelations of something that is quite dormant in the multilateral system that I think we will never have enough time to talk about, the whole reforms that have started or not taken up, but that is an ongoing discussion. But if you allow me, Yoka, one other point that maybe it is important related to the different subject that we have addressed is also the role of men, in the gender context in armed conflict and also in the humanitarian settings. Many humanitarian workers, or most of them also, are men out there, which I think a certain level of risk-taking and a affirmation of masculinity that also puts one in situations of risks and vulnerabilities. And I think we all have to consider ourselves as simple beings. We are not super women and super men in this kind of context, which are very dangerous, and where the humanitarian space is shrinking and shrinking by the day. And it is important also that we take care of ourselves, take care of others, and be humble, and to realize that it is okay to be fearful at times. It is okay to doubt sometimes. It is okay to also to seek for help and then to cope with the different challenges that we are facing. And that I think if men also care for themselves in those contexts, they will be able to care for others as well.
Oh, thank you for that, for these wise words. And we are moving towards the end of our webinar already. But I think we just have time to bring in Val and maybe also Anju on a question that Gita posed and that some already pointed to, which is about the attention to sexual and gender-based violence and protecting women and girls from violence seem to be the only impacts that the humanitarian community has paid attention to. And basically the question is, what needs to get done to get the humanitarian community to begin to address the gendered impacts of conflict, such as on the economic and social impact? So maybe Val and Anju, if you could briefly comment, maybe about 3 minutes each, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close.
Maybe I could suggest that Anju go first, and then I can, because her study deals more directly with that, and then I can conclude, and I have some other things that I'd like to add to the discussion as well. Anju, would you be able to respond?
I think that Geeta's point is really well taken. The big issue, and I think Asa has also pointed out, a lot of humanitarian workers are male. The predominant decision-making bodies are male, the workers are male. And other than sort of setting parity targets, the humanitarian system does not really try very hard to facilitate, first of all, the integration of women in that process. And I think that's one place to start. A second place, because I think the perspective would change and the issues covered would change. But a second issue, certainly in all the humanitarian settings that I have visited, women are desperately trying to find income earning sources and decision-making channels for the coping that they have to do. They have to do a range of coping that perhaps men don't have to do. And recognizing that as an essential need for women to have economic security of some type when we design cash for work programs, cash transfer programs, when we design health infrastructure and the roles in that infrastructure is absolutely a critical point to start bringing gender into. And I see that starting to happen with cash related programs, but not work related programs. And that's a shift that's absolutely, and a health system would be a great place to start because women's integration in that is very obvious where that can happen.
I would just add to Anju's really excellent points that I think one of the things when I was working on health systems and gender, one of the things that we did in our work is we outlined what a gender equitable health system looks like. And I think that maybe one of the things that we need to do is integrate into our understanding of humanitarian responses what a more gender equitable response would look like. And that would help everyone in terms of understanding the critical role that gender equality plays and these implicit biases that we all hold about gender and social norms. And I'd just like to add a couple of other comments in response to some of the discussion. I think that the issue of the COVID response, we've heard from a lot of people that are sitting in contexts of fragility. I'm sitting in Ottawa, and one of the things that upsets me is that we hear very little about COVID in contexts like Syria and Yemen and South Sudan, and we seem to be witnessing a turning inwards. So this kind of this nationalism. And one of the hopes that I have is that this incredible advocacy, and I would echo some of the comments about the role of local knowledge networks and national actors in driving understandings of their context. One of my hopes is that those stories will begin to be told and be heard in places like Ottawa, like Washington, like London, and we can return to a human dignity, human security, human potential focused foreign policy and a multilateralism that implements that approach. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for adding that, and also for ending this session. That indeed we hope that these stories will begin to change, the way we've looked at this, mostly from a domestic perspective, and return to, as you said, towards a more human security focused approach and to a bigger emphasis on multilateralism. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we've really come to the end of our webinar, and we've had such a rich discussion that it's impossible to summarize. But here are some things that we covered. Val presented the pathways by which health and gender can help societies move from vicious cycles of conflict and violence to more virtuous cycles and peaceful societies. Jason focused on the relatively circumscribed role that COVID plays in violence against humanitarian workers, and Andrew on how the failure to integrate gender into COVID responses has exacerbated risks to women and girls' health, safety, and livelihood. We are very grateful to the speakers and panelists for sharing their insights, and also for all the points that were raised during the discussion, which will hopefully help to shape our strategies to address health inequities and gender inequalities when we're building back better from the pandemic in fragile contexts. Again, a big thank you to our speakers, to our panelists, and of course to all the participants, and especially to the team that helped putting this webinar together. Thank you very much to everyone, and all of you have a good day, evening or night, wherever you are. And it was a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.